Welcome to Sci-Fi Distilled, guys. I am very happy to have our special guest, Doug Drexler, here tonight. He is going to talk about all his favorite science fiction films, if we have enough time. Sure, there's a lot. So, and of course, Mary Beth is with us again, and I hope you all have your drinks.
Mary Beth.
So every night we start with a toast to whatever. Toast our watchers, toast each other, toast the science fiction that we love.
Salud, guys.
Salud.
So welcome, buddy, Bruce Playfair, and just join in. Thanks, guys, for joining us. So, Doug, what is your favorite science fiction movie?
Well,
let's jump
that's
right
a hard
in.
question, because I love so many of them. If I had to choose one, I would have to go by the movie I've watched more than any other movie probably over the years, and it's got to be 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. With James Mason and Kirk Douglas. It was the first movie I saw as a kid that I wrote a fan letter to, and Disney actually sent me back pictures of the submarine.
Wow.
So that really left a big impression on me. But the movie is such a masterpiece. It's such a work of art. It's just never been equaled. It's in a class by itself.
It certainly is one of my favorites from when I was a kid. I remember watching it, of course, back in the 70s when I grew up. I'm a little younger than you. You watch stuff that was on television, like movies like that weren't in.
But that some of my favorite films are from 1933.
Right.
So
how did you see them? You had to wait. How did you see them? In other words, were they on rebroadcast on television or?
Well, in a way, my generation was kind of fortunate in our introduction to classic films, because when I was growing up, when I was a kid, when I was born in 53, and 60s was like prime years for being a kid for me. And there were only 3 channels, NBC, CBS, ABC. But aside from that, there were a couple of, what do you call them? Syndicated channels. Local
independents
channels. Yeah. Now, I grew up in New York City.
Yep.
So we had WPIX, WOR, Channel 13, NEW, Channel 5. What was 5? 5 was NEW. It's where you had shows like Soupy Sales. I don't know if you know who Soupy Sales is.
Yeah, sure.
Zachary, the Ghoul host, and then there'd be roller derby, stuff like that. But they were looking for programming, and all the movies, from the point where they had sound from the point where sound was developed,
right,
up until like the late 50s, that was stuff that they were able to farm and run constantly on television. So it was a period of 30 under maybe 20 years of movies, which were all from the classic days of film. Now, when you look back, when you're going all the way back to 1933, there's so many movies. There's so much stuff, and you've got streaming to watch anything you want all the time. You don't get any kind of a guided tour of the classics. In order for a kid to watch one of the classics now, the odds that they're going to watch it, I mean, I can't tell you how many people that I talked to who came to work for us on Galactica, young visual effects people, who wouldn't watch a movie because it was in black and white. And I'm like, oh my God, I mean, all the classics are in black and white. You're never going to watch a black and white movie.
Right.
You'll have no idea where it all came from,
Yeah, it's true.
So that's amazing. So can we dive into 20,000 Leagues a little bit more? What specifically captured your imagination? Because I was brushing up on it, and wow, the work they did to film underwater was
it was actually shot in the Bahamas.
But they had
in the ocean.
Yeah, scuba.
And it was a first-class cast. I mean, you had Peter Lorre, Kirk Douglas, James Mason.
Yeah.
It and also it was Walt Disney's first live action feature. So a lot was riding on that film.
And just interesting side note, the director, Fleischer,
Richard Fleischer.
he was Max Fleischer's son. Max was Walt Disney's like kind of competition because Max
That's
did
right.
little comics or something.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I worked with I worked with Richard Fleischer. Now Fleischer did another movie that it was called Fantastic Voyage. You ever seen Fantastic Voyage, where they they miniaturize a submarine and they inject it into a critically wounded person, and they travel through the circulatory system to remove a clot in the scientist's brain. It's one of my favorite all-time movies. I think it was 1966.
It had Raquel Welch, so.
Well, it had Raquel Welch, and there's a scene in there where all the kids my age who are like prepubescent. there's a scene where they're all in scuba, so they're all in skin tight, gear, and she is attacked by antibodies, and they wrap themselves around her like a mummy almost, and all the guys are trying to rip them off of her. Yeah. And it's like an adolescent's dream come true.
Hey, Mike and Denise just joined us. I don't mean to interrupt you, but I just want to shout out. Welcome, Mike and Denise Okuda.
Oh, they're here?
Yep, they're on.
Oh, Mike and Denise, I miss you. We're talking about.
We miss all of you guys all the time.
It's crazy, isn't it? We're talking about movies and I know that most of them are the same ones that you loved as kids. And I'm talking about how our generation, there weren't 1,000 channels and all kinds of streaming. So we had more of a guided tour of classic films because that's all syndicated channels could afford to show. And there was only like a 30-year period, 25-year period that they could pull from. So we saw all the classics. And 1933 was an amazing year for fantasy and science fiction films. 1933, you had King Kong, you had The Wizard of Oz, and Frankenstein. Oh my God! I mean, those are three of the greatest movies ever made. King Kong is one. that original King Kong, nothing compares to it as far as storytelling and charm. I didn't like the most current remake that was done that had who the hell was Carl Denham? Jack Black played Carl Denham and played him as a cad, which really pissed the hell out of me because Carl Denham is one of the greatest action heroes of all time, and he's so lovable and wonderful. He's a director. He's a film director, and basically all of the movies he's done in the past were like nature films, where they'd go to Africa, bring them back alive films. And he had heard rumors of this island and came across a map. In that way, it was very reminiscent of Indiana Jones. Found a map of an island that wasn't charted called Skull Island. And this is where natives lived, and that they lived down near the beach. And there was this massive wall that was built so long ago, no one even remembers why it was built. But the rumor is there's that wall was made to keep something out of the village. That movie, I told you I lived in New York City. On WOR, they had a show called $1 Million Movie. And the theme for it was the theme from Gone with the Wind. And
I remember
they would show the same movie all week, just like a movie theater.
Yeah.
And they would show it like 4 times a day. They'd show it in the morning, they'd show it at lunchtime, they'd show it. And I can still remember the spiel, the voice would say, if you enjoyed King Kong or would like to see any part of King Kong again, and they would list all the times. I would watch that movie over and over and over, and it just never ever wore out. And whoever's listening, if you haven't seen the original King Kong, and I know that, Mike and Denise, I know you're probably thinking, who the hell wouldn't have seen that? But when I was working with Gary on visual effects, bringing visual effects artists and young people, they didn't know who Ray Harryhausen was. They never watched the original King Kong. And I'd say, no, it's a must-watch movie. You have to understand where we came from. This is a film you should watch.
Can you say why? Why is it must watch?
I mean, that's like asking me, why is there, why are we here? for everybody, it's different. It's a combination. It's a perfect storm of things. A perfect storm of storytelling, visual effects, art direction, the actors, the chemistry of the actors. It's all those things together. And if it was easy to quantify, everyone would make a masterpiece film, but it isn't, but it's one of my favorites. And Frankenstein the original Frankenstein with Boris Karloff is an all-time. I find that some of these movies, as we get further and further away from them, it's almost like peering into another dimension because it's so long ago at this point.
Yep.
We're going on 100 years, right?
Yeah.
That's it. To be able to look back, it's like peering into another. In some ways, it adds to the aesthetic and the feeling of the environment that makes it seem larger than life. I mean, for instance, if you watch the original Star Trek now, and we're talking like 50 years or something like that, there are things about it that create this a feeling, an environment that seems like another time. When you watched it in 1966, it was a different feeling from it. It actually had, it's like a fine wine in a way. It's aging, and you start to view it through a different lens the further we get away from it. And the original Star Trek has if you are watching television in 1966, and Star Trek was revolutionary for science fiction in '66, but if you were watching it then, there were so many things about it that were not unlike the other shows that were on the air. The other shows had the same kind of pacing. The other shows had the same look as far as lighting. All the other shows looked a lot like Star Trek. Star Trek was looking a lot like the other shows. It was just an accepted way that you told the story and filmed and act breaks and stuff like that. How's that for blather?
Just while we got a little bit of a break there, I just wanted to say hey to Sean O'Halloran and Dave Lafredo. Thanks for joining us. Michael Kudus is the first, or it could be Denise. I think they're under the same account here. It was the first movie to make use of amazing visual effects technology and the kind of storytelling. Everything that follows owes a lot to King Kong, which it absolutely is right along with.
Ray Harryhausen was an assistant to Willis O'Brien on King Kong. Now I know you're not that familiar with Harryhausen, Mary Beth.
I know Willis, not Harry. Yeah.
Ray Harryhausen did incredible films from the late 50s and 60s and even into the early 70s, like Jason and the Argonauts. Have you ever seen Jason and the Argonauts?
Yep.
Don't nod your head unless you're telling me that.
I have. Absolutely.
Yes or no?
Absolutely. I love that movie.
Yeah, Jason and the Argonauts, 20 million miles to Earth. It came. What's the one with the giant octopus that attacked San Francisco? It was. He was. You look at it now, and it's getting pretty creaky. But then again, it's starting to take on that kind of.
It's all the stop action stuff.
When you leave something to marinate in the refrigerator, these movies, they marinate in it's a temporal marination, that gives them something they didn't even have when they were originally made. When you look at 1933 Frankenstein, the James Whale film, it feels like an alternate reality, so those were plus because syndicated networks, local networks, could only afford to farm this period. As a kid, you were getting a very directed look at motion pictures over the years, and in a way, kids don't have that anymore. There's way too much to choose from.
Yeah,
you don't get that kind of course that we got, and that's kind of a shame in a way. I mean, it's wonderful to have everything at your fingertips, and here's another thing I mentioned: 1933, King Kong, Wizard of Oz, Frankenstein, all in the same year. I mean, that's insane. Um, one of the things that was wonderful, and I know Mike and Denise had this too, was that when we were growing up, there was no streaming, obviously, there was no internet. There were no video recorders. You couldn't rent a tape or a DVD or anything. So I think CBS had bought the air rights to The Wizard of Oz.
Yes.
Wizard of Oz would only be shown once a year. It was around Thanksgiving and Christmas time.
Yep.
And it was an event. I mean, you couldn't even wait. You were so giddy to see this movie. And your parents let you stay up late. And CBS had they'd have a break in the middle for commercials, which was so unusual for television at the time. And you were having I wouldn't be surprised if half the country was tuned in to watch The Wizard of Oz. So you had this kind of communal experience,
Right.
which was the same with television at the time. There was only so much you could watch. So most of you would be tuned in to, although I got to say that when I was a kid, Star Trek was not like massively popular. Because when I was a kid, at that age, you were a weirdo if you liked science fiction or if you read, comic books and stuff. I got mocked at school all the time. They called me the man from Mars, that they had been brainwashed into thinking it was kiddie stuff. It was the same for comic books as well. Comic books were my father told you, that's for idiots, comics. Those are for idiots. That was the common perception
Right.
at the time. So at that time, it was kind of a private club. And I know Mike and Denise know about this as well. When you were watching Star Trek and because you knew about science fiction, and it was so amazing and so unusual, it was a private club. And in a way, I miss those days of you had to be a little weird to watch it,
Well, those shows is what I can definitely say is what got me into reading the classic science fiction. It got me interested in books by like Arthur C. Clarke and Isaac Asimov. Arthur C. Clarke's one of my favorites. I think I've read everything he's written. So it not only did you expand my interest in science fiction within movies and television, but within literature as well, which is another whole area that is untapped, and not everything is made into a movie. There's some great.
The thing about when I was a kid was that you couldn't get good science fiction unless you read a book. The book was the only place you could find it. For instance, the early Marvel stuff in the late 50s and right through the 60s up until about 68 or 69, when Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko and those guys were doing those comic books that are monster movies now.
Yeah,
that was the you couldn't even do those stories in movies and television until visual effects caught up. CG made those movies possible.
Yeah.
But Stan and Jack and those guys were doing really amazing, epic science fiction at a time where it was rare. That's why Marvel in the early 60s was so big on campus, because the kids were appreciating these sophisticated stories.
Yeah. Mike Okuda says he couldn't even talk about Star Trek at the dinner table. Not until his parents saw the credit at Star Trek 4 that he was okay to talk about Star Trek at the dinner table.
I remember, I don't know how true this is because Gene Roddenberry is really good at building a mythology, but he said that after Star Trek aired the first time, he said his father went around the neighborhood and apologized to the neighbors and that his son would be doing a good old-fashioned Western soon enough. Gene, and if you're on my Facebook page, you know this already, but Gene wrote a lot of Westerns. And he was, in the making of Star Trek, he says that he was the head writer on Have Gun Will Travel, which was a sophisticated Western for the time. It wasn't really like any the other Westerns. But he was not the head writer. He was exaggerating. But he was a leading writer on Have Gun Will Travel. He wrote like 24 episodes of that show. But yeah, Gene claimed that his father was embarrassed that he was doing, goofy ray guns and spaceships. And believe me, I'm telling you, back then it was considered to be junk.
Yeah. It must have been generational. My parents never has saw an episode of Star Trek, never saw Star Wars, never understood what my interest in any of this stuff was. My dad was a big fan of the Apollo program and NASA and all that stuff, and I learned most because he was very encouraging anything to do with the space program that I was interested in. But when it got to science fiction, it was just
Well, the interesting thing was that during the race to the moon, which for me, Mike, and Denise was a really huge. It really affected us for the rest of our lives. When space travel, when it was, in some ways, people have kind of gotten used to, the space missions. But when we were kids, when a Gemini capsule would go up, or Apollo, or they were headed to the moon, when you went to school, that's what you did that day. They had the TVs on, and you watched from liftoff all the way through it. You didn't do anything else that day. It was all about the mission. So it was like an epic, wonderful period for, as far as our culture is concerned. We're kind of blasé about going into space at this point. Although I got to say, it's so exciting what's going on. I mean, we're to the point where it's almost like science fiction was. Where in science fiction, when I was reading it as a kid, it usually wasn't governments who were sending spaceships up. It was like entrepreneurs and private people building stuff in their garage, practically.
Yeah.
Tom Swift type of people. And I never thought that we're at a point where it had to be governments. I always thought it had to be governments to be able to fund such a thing. But we're entering this like science fiction era where individuals with companies or industrialists that are into science, are taking a hand, and they're beyond what the government is able to do, and they're not so affected by what the Air Force wants and what the CIA wants. And I mean, the space shuttle didn't turn out quite the way the scientists and the NASA astronauts wanted. They had to deliver something that all the different branches of the military that served them as well, but when you get someone like, Bezos or Musk, or what's his name from Virgin?
Mary, what'd you say?
Richard Branson or
Richard Branson. Richard Branson and Spaceship One and the most incredible thing, when we were kids, spaceships landed on their tails. In Ray Bradbury stories, spaceships landed on their tails, silver spaceships. I mean, that became, as we got into the space race, and going to the moon, that became kind of a science fiction joke. Rocket ships that land on their tails. And,
don't you think, though?
Oh my God! Look what's happening. It seems impossible. Sometimes I look at, especially I think Musk had one, where two of them came down at the same
simultaneously.
time.
Yeah,
it looked like a visual effect. It doesn't even look real,
It looked like a visual effect. Yes.
Yeah, it is amazing
because it's so outside our, landing platforms in the ocean.
But
barges that they land on.
Yeah, initially I think that was what NASA had wanted to do. Had they been given more than 9 years to do it, they realized that they didn't have the technology anywhere near to do it that way, or the shuttle was actually, I think, more their at the time. But I think what happened was, we got to get something up and down in 9 years, so splash down. I think that's where
the Russians were, they were landing their guys on solid ground.
Yeah, that must have been quite the jolt.
Well, yeah.
But,
so Doug, while we're on it, what would your druthers be? Like, where do you think we should go next? Should we try to go to Mars? Should we try?
Well, I always thought that Werner von Braun had the plan, and they just dropped it once the big space race was over. But we should have had a space station much sooner. I mean, I think von Braun was predicting we would be on Mars by the end of the 70s or something like that.
Well, I mean, you look at a lot of the TV shows, they certainly thought by 2000, certainly we would have been far more advanced.
Yeah. Well, I mean, That's what happens when you get, politics and government
Money.
involved in things,
Always, yeah.
Once
I
the
mean,
race was
We've
over,
evolved to a point where, because and the technology has evolved to the point where private citizens with big corporations like Bezos and, you know, that I never thought, that boggles my mind, especially being an old time reader of science fiction, to see that actually happening. And SpaceX has a big mission at the end of this month. They're sending astronauts in the
Yep.
Dragon capsule, right? Holy cow. That's going to be as exciting as anything I've ever watched, because who knows what can happen. I visited SpaceX a couple of years ago, and that was really something to me. That was science fiction to do that, to go in there, and over there you could see they're painting rocket bodies, and over here there's a computer printing room where they're printing engine parts.
wow.
And in that corner over there is their mission control, and right over here they're building it, and over here are the guys sitting on the monitors and watching. Of course, the other beautiful thing, we have JPL right out here, and we have Mike and Denise have friends at JPL, and we've gotten to visit, and that's really incredible in the history of that place. And to visit there just takes your breath away. And what's really amazing is when you make friends with people, at JPL, or, they grew up on Star Trek, and they feel like Star Trek had something to do, definitely had something to do with, who they became. I remember we had a couple of guys. I don't think I was there at the time. We had a couple of guys from NASA who came to visit Voyager, and Mike and Denise took them on a tour of Voyager. And when they sat in the captain's chair, it was like so thrilling. And of course, it's thrilling to all of us to do that. But a little later, me, Mike, Denise, Dorothy went to a launch of the space shuttle. And Mike and Denise got there a little early. I wish I could have gotten there earlier, because they took them onto the pad where the space shuttle was, and they were able to, in their bunny suits, go on board the space shuttle.
Wow.
While it was on the pad. And Mike and Denise played the video. They were taking video, and Mike is on the flight deck, and he's like blown away. And one of the NASA guys says, "Well, now you know how we felt when we sat in Janeway's chair." And I could see Mike going,
Same.
because what's the comparison?
It's
I love Star Trek too, but
yeah.
there's a space shuttle on the launch pad.
It's actually going, yeah.
Yeah. I when I lived in Florida, I lived in Tampa, which is obviously the opposite side of the state, but we could still see when they would launch. You just wait, a minute after launch, and then you could see it, especially at night. You could see that flame tail. So that was always the closest I ever got to a real launch, but it was really cool. But one of the coolest things I remember, I used to be really into model airplane flying, and I was at a field and I was flying the model airplanes, and we were very close to MacDill Air Force Base. And for some reason, the shuttle on top of the 747 had to land there at MacDill because it has, military length a runway that it needs. And all of a sudden we're sitting there, and here comes the 747 with the shuttle. I don't know which one it was on the back of it. And it was low because we were very close to the Air Force Base. And I was just like, we're all like, everything stopped, people landed their model airplanes because, nobody's
when they retired, they got one of the shuttles at the Science Museum here in LA. And when they flew it into LA, they flew it in on the back of the 747. And before they did that, they did fly-arounds around all parts of LA. And we were working on Galactica, and Gary and I went up on the roof, Gary Hutzel went up on the roof of the building, the Hitchcock building. And they brought the shuttle and circled Universal Studios low. And I got some great pictures of it. But it was funny. I found a shot on the internet, really high res, looking across the space shuttle and the jet that were accompanying it, straight down to Universal Studios. and I was able to find me and Gary on the roof. Oh boy!
It says it was Endeavor.
You know, there's a video that they show at the Science Museum of how they got it from the airport to the museum, which was epic. That alone was epic. How they figured the entire route out and where they were going to have to take down a light pole, and they knew already. And it's an amazing video. I'm sure they still show it, but it was amazing. One of the most disappointing things I ever saw, and I kept it. It was the front page of the LA Times, and it was a picture that was in the backyard of some house, and through the driveway you could see out in the street this big giant nose of the space shuttle moving by their house, and these kids were like playing basketball in the back.
Yeah.
And I was so shocked by that. The space shuttle is in your front yard and you're playing basketball. I don't get it. I don't get
Kids today, Doug. Kids today.
Yeah.
Well, you know, they're used to a lot of things that are new in science fiction.
That's true. Because I think the modern movies have numbed us to awe in a certain level.
Well, we just did Apollo 13 last week, and that didn't numb us to awe. We were in awe.
No, I don't mean our generation. I mean the younger generation. They see these visual effects, and I think they are somewhat. It takes a lot to impress them.
No, I agree. I agree. You know, the movies and the visual effects are so amazing these days.
I mean, because really anything that you can imagine, they can create.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
You know, it's like there was a joke on The Big Bang Theory. It's like, you know, if they took all the money they made trying to make a good Hulk movie, they could probably actually make a real Hulk.
I gotta say, the Marvel movies are, you know, they have their ups and downs, but if you follow them, the more of them you see, the more mind-boggling they become, because you realize that they seem to have had a plan from day one, that there are 22 movies that all interweave with each other. And as you go back, like the first two that were big was Iron Man and Captain America, which I love Captain America, which is Joe Johnston, you know, who did The Rocketeer and was a designer on Star Wars and stuff. And I got derailed there. Where was I going with that?
Movies have that are linked.
Oh yeah. You know, I go back and watch Captain America again because it's a lot of their movies you can repeat and repeat and repeat, and the more you watch them, the better they actually get. Like Star Trek
Things, right?
Was that?
You see things. You start picking up on little things.
Yeah, I mean, in the first Captain America movie, I had no idea that glowy thing that the Red Skull was going after was an Infinity Stone. That there were 5 others that all. And everything interweaves across 22 movies to, you know, culminate in Infinity Wars and Endgame. And also you realize that all of those movies were the story of Captain America, who really, you know, he was frozen in the ice at the end of Captain America and came out in our time and then ended up going back. You know, it's just one interwoven story about him. And of course, they did such an amazing job getting top flight actors to play those characters. You know, Ruffalo, Robert Downey.
Robert Downey Jr. is Tony Stark. I mean,
yeah, I mean,
couldn't have picked a better person to play him.
Well, you know, I mean, when I was a kid in the late 50s, and I think that Fantastic Four and Iron Man and stuff like that was happening like 1962-ish. And so I was reading these things as they were being invented. And Iron Man, of course, is a favorite of mine. And I ended up friends with a guy named Don Heck, who used to draw Iron Man in the early days. When I was a kid, and I wanted to, you know, it just hit me one day that all these guys are in New York. And I checked the phone book and I found like 3 of them living near me. And Don Heck lived near my house. He lived like about 1.5 miles from my house. And I called him up and he let me come over on Sundays and would throw a piece of tracing paper over my drawings and show me where I went wrong, or, you know. So, and of course, because I lived in New York City and I lived outside New York City, the comics that DC did, like Superman and Batman, they were like kiddie stuff to me because I was a well-read kid. But the idea in those books, Superman lived in Metropolis and Batman lived in Gotham City, and those are not real. But everything Marvel did took place in New York City.
New York City, sure.
You know, and Spider-Man lived in Forest Hills, which is where my dad's TV repair store was. You know, and I would go there with him, and I could recognize the architecture that Steve Ditko put in the books. You know, so it became such an important part of my growing up. And I have to say that when I watch some of these movies, and then I see Stan Lee, who I felt like was an uncle, you know, like Bob Justin or something like that. You know, whenever I see interviews with Stan, I cried when Stan died, and that's really rare for me. But he was such a, you know, I mean, I met him a number of times because I lived in New York, and I used to go up to Marvel in those early days. We had a Star Trek store in Manhattan called the Federation Trading Post. And it was like 1976, I guess. And that type of thing was really unusual. And the store was at 53rd and 3rd, which was some amazing place, real estate for it to be. I mean, Midtown Manhattan. And there was really nothing, you know, you had your odd little comic book shop here and there, but it's not like today. And we had this store. It was just Star Trek, nothing, and there wasn't much. What we could get, you know, the cool stuff, which most of the AMT kids and making Star Trek and the Franz Josef blueprints, and we had posters, but we also had posters made. We had, you know, film clips made, uniforms. We became the center of Star Trek in New York. And when Saturday Night Live did their Belushi episode about Star Trek, they came to us. When Mad Magazine did their satires, they came to us. You know. So I know there was a reason I was steering us in this direction, but I don't remember what it was.
We're talking about Marvel there.
Oh yeah. So thank you. We had a museum that we put in the back of the store. I cut a Matt Jeffries style shaped door in the wall, and we had a museum where we had real props from the show, and we had a 6-foot Klingon ship. And me and Anthony Fredrickson built a computer console that looked like on the show. And we had a press opening for it. And I sent invites to TV stations and stuff like that. And everybody showed up. I mean, when you're in Manhattan, everything is so close. And Marvel was just across town. And I had sent an invitation to Stan Lee. And he came.
Wow.
He came. And my mother was there. And my mother, you know, threw away my comic books. She threw away my comics. And for me, it was a thrill to introduce Stan Lee to my mother. And
did you say this is the woman that threw away your comics?
well, I didn't say that, but I said, Stan, you know, I'd like you to meet my mom. Mom, this is Stan Lee. He wrote all those, you know, comic books. And she said to him, I want you to know that you had more to do with raising my son than I did. And Stan, without missing a beat, said, the last woman who told me that, her son was in Sing Sing, in prison. It was funny. I saw Stan.
That sounds like something you would say.
5 years ago. At Barbara Luna has a Hollywood autograph show down by the LAX. And I went, and Stan was there. And there was a green room where he was. I mean, this guy is like the ever-ready Energizer Bunny. He's signing stuff, you know, for fans, but it's the green room, so it's just you know a number of behind-the-scene people, and we were there with Luna and Dorothy, and I stopped and chatted with Stan for a few minutes, and I related that story to him, which was like quite a few years earlier, and he laughed. He loved his own joke, you know, and I told him, I go, you were my surrogate father. And it was a sweet conversation. And then, of course, there were other people that wanted to talk to him. I couldn't dominate him the whole time. And about 20 minutes went by, and he had a car waiting for him to take him over to the airport. And, I'm thinking, you see so many people all the time who are fawning over him. And He probably doesn't even remember talking to me from 25 minutes ago. And as he's going out the door, he stops, turns, he looks around, and he finds me and he says, "Goodbye, my surrogate son." So that was a thrill. Okay, enough Marvel.
Yeah. What would you say throughout your career? Now, obviously, you've done a lot with different shows, not just Star Trek. What would you say is was the most influential in your end artwork, your end work? What got you, like, whether it be for something you did on Battlestar or Defiance, Star Trek, or what do you think influenced your what we see on the screen?
Well, I mean, what set me up for my career was, did I mention Dick Smith? Dick Smith was like one of the greatest character makeup artists who ever lived. And he influenced every makeup artist. I mean, Rick Baker, Rob Bottin, you name them. He probably helped give them a start to his career. And I went to a movie. I went when The Exorcist first came out, which to me is a horror masterpiece.
Can't watch it.
It's such an amazing film.
It scares the crap out of me.
It's so scary, but it's so beautifully made. I mean, it's so gorgeous. Max von Sydow was in it, and he played an 86-year-old priest, Father Marin.
An old priest and a young priest.
Yeah. There was von Sydow. A few years later, I saw Max von Sydow in another movie, and he was in his 40s. I'm like, wait a minute. And that blew my mind. And I read up on it, and I found out that a guy named Dick Smith did an aging makeup on him. And von Sydow was rubber from here to here, to here, to here, to here. Now, another thing I have to point out, it's not like today where you can do a makeup and it might not be quite up to snuff, and they can go in and smooth everything out in a computer now and make it look flawless. Like some of the characters in the Marvel movies are part makeup, and they go in and blend everything in so that it's absolutely flawless. And Dick Smith did this makeup that was so, I didn't even question it for a second. And it's one thing to do a possessed, monstrously possessed girl, because who's ever seen that? But when you could do a person in their 80s, I mean, we see old people all the time, and not even for 1 second. So that blew my mind, and I started reading up on Dick Smith, and I saw the other stuff that he had done. I mean, Dustin Hoffman, A Little Big Man, where he plays a 110-year-old Jack Crab, and I became fascinated. And in those days, you couldn't look. I could go on YouTube and type in life cast, and I could get 300 videos of people showing how to do a life cast. But when I was starting out, I sounded like the people. Oh, when I was going to school, I had to walk through the snow for 30 miles. But if you want to know how to do a life cast, it was really hard to find out how to do that. And because I was a science fiction fan, I'd been saving articles. There would be fan magazine. There was like a fan magazine called Cinemagic.
Yep, I remember.
It eventually became a real magazine, but it used to be a fanzine. And I had collected copies of that. I think it was the guy who created Cinemagic was the guy who created Cinefex. He went on to create Cinefex. Cinemagic, Doug, where are you going? Oh yes, so I had these articles. I had a file of articles I had saved. I was working at an architectural supply in New York called Charette, and they had a Halloween party. And I said, I've got these articles I saved. And I dug them out, and it was a big article on how to do Planet of the Apes makeup. And I'd never sculpted, I never made a mold in my life or anything. And I decided to give it a shot. What do I have to lose? And I just fell in love with it. It was so remarkable. And when you put a prosthetic makeup on the first time and you've created this life, it affects the people who wear it as well. It totally affects how they act.
Yes.
So that was so outstanding and so amazing that I started doing makeups and making molds, and I just was addicted. And I showed the stuff to a friend of mine named Doug Murray, who Mike and Denise amazingly both No, Doug Murray. It shows how the fan world is all interconnected. I went out to visit Doug at his home on Long Island because he had movie props. He had stuff from Planet of the Apes, including original appliances and all kinds of other wonderful stuff. And I went out to visit him. I brought pictures of stuff I had done. And he said, you know what? I'm going to give you, I just did an interview with Dick Smith. I'm going to give you his home number. He lives in Larchmont. I'm like, Larchmont? That's like only 15 miles north of New York City. So I held on to that number for about 2 weeks because I was so terrified to call this god. I finally built up the courage and called him, and lo and behold, he keeps me on the phone.
You
Sent me stuff, and 3 months later.
Sorry to interrupt. That's how I feel about Mike Westmore. When I have to communicate with him, I get really nervous and scared because he's someone that I look up to, you know? So I think I know how you feel.
He's one of the nicest guys.
He's a sweetheart, yeah.
You could imagine. He's so wonderful, and I was lucky to work with him. I did makeups on Next Generation with him for 3 years. It was one of the best experiences ever. And I've had a lot of wonderful experiences. But about 3 months after I contacted Dick Smith, he called me and said, we're doing a movie called The Hunger with David Bowie and Catherine Deneuve. And it was like a new wave, the first of this new wave kind of vampire flick. It was written by Whitley Strieber, and it was directed by Tony Scott, who was my brain's failing me. Directed Alien, Ridley Scott's brother. And I went to work on that film, and it was my first film job. And I was on it for like 6 months. And it had all these different, there were like 5 different stages of old age for David Bowie. And there were mummy suits. And there was a scene where all the mummies have to crumble. And, you know, today on a computer, it's like a piece of cake, you know? But when I went to work for Dick Smith on that, it took all of us like 6 months to make all these mummies out of a polyfoam mixed with, it was denuded polyfoam, so it would crumble, and put them into molds. And, you know, you'd have to run wire cables through them that you would pull that would cause it to collapse across its face. What an experience. But that's the movie that kind of set me up for working in the business, where I really got my first experience, and really everything rolled out of The Hunger for me, you know. But along the way, there've been so many incredible things. You know, I ended up making Dick hooked me up with John Caglione, and we worked together for over a decade. And then that brought us to Dick Tracy. And there's another movie that set me up in so many ways for my life. It introduced me to Dorothy. I met Dorothy because of Warren Beatty and Dick Tracy. Dick Tracy is what brought me to Los Angeles, which set me up to come to Star Trek. You know, they were shooting the second, they were still in the second season, I think, when I came out. And I just knew that when Dick Tracy was done, I had met Mike Westmore once earlier when I was visiting Bob Justman. And my plan, I was going to make a beeline for Paramount as soon as Dick Tracy was done, which I did. You know, and I begged Mike to work on Star Trek. And he was like, oh, are you kidding me? Why? You're doing, you know, big features and stuff. And no, I don't care about that. It was all about Star Trek, you know. And Gene Roddenberry was still alive, you know. So that's what set me up. And then, you know, to work with Mike, who's the most wonderful, sweet guy. But that then led me to Mike Okuda, who I met on stage one day, and I think embarrassed him a little bit, you know, frothing at the mouth about how great he was. So blown away, especially after working on stage and seeing all the interfaces close up. And the closer you look, the better it got, you know. I mean, wow, whoever's doing this well, I knew who was doing it, because when I had visited Bob Justman before TNG even aired, he mentioned Mike Okuda to me. And I had seen Mike on it was like an Entertainment Tonight thing or something that had Herman and Mike on it. And I was like, that's the guy Bob Justman mentioned. But to meet Mike, the thing about being a Star Trek fan, and which I'm afraid they've shot it in the foot on the new Star Treks, is that you can meet anybody anywhere in the world and start a conversation, and you could talk about everything and it all hangs together. When they start changing how things happen on Star Trek and retooling it, you're kind of, that's they don't seem to understand the magic of the continuity of the first 50 years of Star Trek. Now, when I go to talk to somebody about what happened back in the days of Kirk and Spock, and it's been changed on the whim of the director, So it's a shame they've hurt themselves. But people who are really into the show, you could meet people from all over the world and instantly have a connection and be
We can still do that.
yeah, you feel like you know each other and you've never met, friends you've never met.
One thing I was thinking about recently, and I said about Star Trek, since we're on it, with between the current and even the films, the current, the newer films, is I never appreciated people like you and Mike and Denise, how much you guys influenced what we saw prior
Good
to the
point.
current iterations, as far as keeping to some, not, I don't want to say, I don't know how to really describe it, but just keeping the faith, so to speak, with really what the original show was, and kind of modernizing that, and not losing what was had. And I think now that we see what can happen when we don't have people that really are passionate about it, are kind of running it.
I mean, I know that back when we were doing the show, guys like Rick Berman took a lot of abuse from fans, I thought, on the internet, because besides on the internet, there's so many people who just want to go and beat somebody up. But a lot of credit has to be given, even though we didn't agree with everything that he did. A lot of credit has to be given to Rick Berman for not stepping on that too much. When you see what's happened now, you realize that Rick really was a good guy, and that we got to keep things on track. He didn't. There were things that, I know that he felt his hands. I think he'd actually said it, that books like the Tech Manual and the Encyclopedia kind of tied their hands a little bit because they had to adhere to that. But on the other hand, you look at that stuff and you see how it helped create some of the episodes, and some of the movies came from out of the Tech Manual and out of the Encyclopedia, But you see, Rick started with Gene Roddenberry, and I know that he would break some of Gene's rules, probably gleefully, but it wasn't that heinous like it is now. I still felt like Rick was serving Star Trek, and I feel like what happens is this, and I've written articles about this. The same reason why DC comic movies crash and burn left and right, and that you can't get into them. They're for the most part. I love Wonder Woman. I thought Wonder Woman was great. Could have been a Marvel movie.
It was the best DC.
Yeah, it was great. And the Marvel movies earned such a fierce fandom. The reason is because of the quality control. They have a group of people who know the comics, love them, and then you have Kevin Feige, who's a producer who respects the source material. And he's serving Marvel. He's serving the Marvel stories. Over at DC, they keep bringing in, they did the same thing happened with Star Trek, bring in a hotshot director and give it to him. What happens is that every time you do Batman, it's a totally different thing, totally different guy, totally different everything. And people don't, I understand flexing yourself creatively and not wanting to, but you build a love from the fans when they can count on what they're going to see. And then you're able to tie things together that make it even more amazing, like the Marvel movies, and realize that they meant to do it. It wasn't a mistake. That's why Marvel is monstrous and why DC keeps going, because you keep bringing in directors who see themselves as bigger than the property. And when you get that, like J.J. Abrams with Star Trek,
Yeah,
you
he
know,
redeemed franchises.
I saw those Mission Impossible movies are pretty good. I saw J.J. Abrams on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. It was before the first movie came out.
I know where you're going with this. Go ahead.
It was hysterical.
Yeah.
He was telling his story about Star Trek, and he was saying, "I never really liked Star Trek." And
Jon Stewart.
well, but before that, he even says, and this was like a knife in my heart. He says, "I always hated it when they got philosophical and stuff." And I was like, "Oh God, that's what sets it apart from everything else." And then Jon Stewart is looking at him, and he goes, "You know, I think I stopped hearing you when you said you didn't like Star Trek."
Yes,
But
he did. Good for Jon
somebody,
Stewart.
who sees themselves as bigger and they're going to fix it,
Yeah. So we're
And
just
you
doing a little time check here. It is 7:56, so we've only got about 4 minutes left.
We can keep going. I mean,
We can keep going.
I'm on Doug's schedule.
Well, I can't stay on too much longer because Dorothy's getting dinner ready.
Oh,
yeah.
But
I
we can-
know that's going to be a
We did,
treat.
have ask a few questions. So let me try to pick out a question.
Okay.
Bruce wants to know, Bruce Playfair, if you remember him from Ticonderoga, in recent movies, what's come out recently? What's the last most modern classic film that you've seen that you think will be influencing generations to come?
Oh, all the Marvel movies. There's no
The
doubt.
Marvel movies, yeah, of course.
They're monstrous, and I am, like I said, I was there from the beginning and when all those characters have been created. I used to go up to Marvel. Stan Lee, I always felt like he was my uncle. If anybody is going to hate those things, it would have been me. And I didn't like a lot of the early ones that were done before the MCU happened. The Hulk movies were, oh God, the Fantastic Four movies. What a shame.
Yeah,
What's
why can't
ironic
they
is
just
that
can't make a good one?
if MCU does Fantastic Four, I'm sure they'll pull it off.
Yeah.
But the irony is that the Fantastic Four was like their first superhero comic in the 60s.
It was my favorite Marvel.
It was their top of the line. And the story, almost everything you've seen in the movie so far, like the Black Panther and the stuff in Doctor Strange with Dormammu and all those all came from. So those movies, I mean, look, they're going to be studying those long after we're gone because the impact that they made culturally.
And financially.
I mean, it's really remarkable.
Sue says if you could ever post the picture that you were describing of the space shuttle from above the shuttle looking back down at Universal with you, if you could ever post that someday.
Sure. I'll repost it on my Facebook page.
David Harvey says, what are you watching right now during your isolation, during your COVID quarantine?
Well, I hate to sound geeky, but Dorothy and I have rewatched the Marvel movies numerous times since we went into and the wonderful thing about it is that she gets as big a kick as I do over them. Part of it is because she knows I love it, but she really has fallen in love with the characters. It's hard not to fall in love with Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man and Chris as Thor. The Thor movies were really, Thor was kind of stiff and serious in the first few Thor movies, and then Waititi, who did Jojo Rabbit, did Thor Ragnarok.
Oh, that was great.
Found that character's
That was probably one of my favorites.
It is so funny, and Jeff Goldblum is the villain.
Yeah,
it's a riot, and we'll watch that. We quote each other. We quote it to, we quote a lot of those movies during the day to each other. I love you 3000.
Yeah.
That. It's the same wonderfulness that the original Star Trek had, because it has a heart and it trusts itself.
It has a little humor. Yeah, it has everything.
Yeah.
No, that was one of the best. I mean, there are a lot of them that are very good, but Ragnarok was probably in my top 3 or 4.
It was such a surprise. I mean, and I know that he's doing the next one, which I think is Love and Thunder.
Yeah.
And he's such an unusual person, it's going to be off the wall.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
it's 8. So I am afraid we are going to have to say goodbye next week.
But wait, yes, I got my screen. Hang on.
Oh, he's got his screen ready. Okay.
Yeah,
here.
we have.
Let's see.
We're doing Buckaroo Banzai.
Oh boy, cool. Oh, I'm definitely going to watch that.
Classic The Adventures of Buckaroo. In fact, I just literally watched this last night.
You've never seen Buckaroo Banzai?
No. I've seen it. I hadn't seen it in a while, but I just rewatched it.
You know, the thing was that when Banzai was in the theaters, I didn't see it in the theaters.
No, I don't think I did either.
I didn't really see it until I came to work with Mike and Denise. And it's always been such an important movie to Denise. I mean, she was involved with Banzai from day one, you know.
We will have Mike and Denise with us. We're super excited to talk to them. I can't wait to.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it was Mike, especially Denise, who got me, you know, indoctrinated into Buckaroo Banzai. And, you know, when we were in the art department together, we used to play favorite movies over and over again. And you kind of get into the rhythm of the film and enjoy it. You know, we were all like a bunch of kids in our room hanging out, doing work, but having these movies that we loved in the background, you know. And so Banzai is a really important film to all of us.
Excited.
Yeah, it really is a good film.
With
Well,
that,
Doug, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure. I'm done. Look, I finished it.
We're looking forward to Orville season 3.
Yes, we are.
Yeah,
Can't wait.
you know, when we go back to work, it's going to be so strange because the whole world has shifted on its axis. And what is it like to make a movie, you know, when you're protecting against the pandemic? It's going to be. Seth MacFarlane was on the Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon last night. I posted, and he talks about Orville post-pandemic. He says, in the middle of the season, everyone's going to end up fat with white beards. You know, you know.
Wonder if he'll reference it like in the show, like remember in 2020 the pandemic, you know, or something would be funny.
Well, yeah, you know, they could do a show that comments on something like that. But they've raised the bar for season 3. I'm lucky to be there for this season. And Robert Strohmeyer, the art director, said that I came in at a perfect time because they built a lot of new sets and I got to put my imprint on them. And you know,
they have in you.
What's that?
I hope they know what a treasure they have in you. I see them.
Well, you know, the interesting thing is that not everybody who works in Hollywood is a big Star Trek geek, and they don't necessarily know anything about me. And Robert and Stephen, art director, Stephen Lineweaver, both wonderful guys, didn't really know me from anybody. And it's easy when you see these shows being done that so resemble shows that you had worked on and you don't get a call or you're not involved. It's easy to take it personally, but you have to remember that they don't know who you are. You know, that's what it boils down to. And when I got the job, and it was through Jeff Mandel, who I snuck on the Star Trek the Motion Picture sets with all those years ago, who works in the business. He worked on Star Trek with us. Robert called him, and Jeff was busy because he's busy all the time. And he says, "Have I got a guy for you?" And I got in contact with Strohmeyer, and I sent him, you know, my ArtStation page, and he called me up and said, "Can you come in for a meeting?" And they like hired me instantly. But the main thing, and I knew this from the other people who had been working there for a while, they're always concerned: is this person going to fit in? You know, because that's the most important thing. You know, you can have a really talented person, bring them in, and they could be a jerk, diva, you know, and just, so at this point, and I'd been on the show almost 6 months, they know all about me now. We do a lot of laughing and play practical jokes, and so I'm part of another great family.
That's great.
I'm really,
and Zeth is of course a big Star Trek fan, so
he's a huge Star Trek fan, and I really haven't, I haven't really had a moment to even chat with the guy. We've seen each other on stage, and but when you're the producer and you're the writer and you're the director and you're the star, you've got a million, and you're also doing American Dad, and what's the other one?
Family Guy.
Family Guy. And he's recording albums where he sings and croons. It's like, holy, I feel like like an amoeba next to this guy. I mean, I've always said, well, I'm no one-trick pony. I could do a lot of stuff. I'm like nothing compared to this guy. And so I'm hoping I know that he knows who I am. I've become good friends with Tom Constantino, who's a producer, editor on the show, who is a huge Star Trek fan. And when I first met him, he was like, kind of like tongue-tied because I'm Doug Drexler, and of course I love it, and it's something that, especially when you're in the business almost 40 years, it's interesting to see what happens. Brandon Fayette, who's our visual effects supervisor, we're riding in a golf cart coming back from one of the stages. He goes, when I first watched Star Trek: The Next Generation, I was 7 years old, and which is fantastic. But it gives you this makes you feel good or something.
Doug, I don't know if I ever told you the first time that me and Mary Beth met you. Remember, we picked you up at the airport in Albany.
Yeah.
Mary Beth was going to go pick you up, and she had a little tiny car. And I was like, you gonna fit in that with her luggage and everything? I said, let me drive. Dennis wanted me to go with her, and because he didn't want her driving down there at night alone. I said, with 3 people in this car and your luggage is. I said, I got the truck. It's got the extra seat in the back. She goes, well, I don't know. He's from Hollywood. He might not want to drive in a truck.
Like the truck.
And I'm like, it's like a $35,000 truck. I'm like, it's not. And then we're all like, I don't know. What do you think? What's gonna be like? We're all like Hollywood, thinking, oh my God. And of course, now that we know you,
so scared and nervous.
I'll tell you, even to this day, we work with a sign shop that's up north, and they have a truck driver who would bring me backlit plexi and stuff like that they would make for me. And one day he says to me, I've always had a bad attitude about Hollywood people, I mean, a lot of the country loves movies, but they'll say Hollywood. Those people are sick, And he said, and he just wanted to tell me, since he started delivering stuff to the studio and meeting everybody and finding out we're just like you are, and we laugh, and it like changed his whole. I had one funny. I was on a Toys That Made Us.
Yeah.
You ever see the Toys That Made Us that I was on, the Star Trek episode? And I'm working in the Orville art department, and this guy comes in, and he's looking around for, he's got a box, and he says, do you know where this is? And I look at it, I go, oh yeah, that's American Horror Story. They're upstairs and blah, blah, blah. He says, I asked you because I saw you on the Toys That Made Us last night.
You're famous. You're famous. You even know.
It's fun, but it's just the effect that Hollywood has. It's magic. It's the magic store. It's where magic comes from. How can you not like it? But it's funny how many people will, talk about, Hollywood and what a rotten, stinking place. But tell them to give up their movies and TV. It ain't gonna happen.
Yeah. Well, all right, guys. On that note.
Yeah. Once again, thank you so much for joining us. Maybe we'll have to do this again.
Thanks everybody for tuning in. And Mike and Denise, I miss you so much. I think what we should do is have a Zoom meeting, and get you guys, and we'll get Luna, and and we'll just like have a little get together. It's really fun, and so we should do that.
I don't think he meant me and you, Mary Beth.
Well,
That's okay. We understand.
Only kidding.
We won't take it personally. All right. Well, on that note, for the 3rd time, we're going to say goodnight. Thanks again. And everybody stay safe, stay separated.
Yep.
And,
be smart. Be smart.
And be
Don't listen
smart.
to the goofy theories out there. They're insane.
Yes.
Okay.
Good night, guys.